From the iconic defiance of the Boston Tea Party, right through to the powerful contemporary movements really reshaping our world today. Acts of resistance, calls for justice, displays of power. They define so much of human history. But what truly connects these, disparate acts and events, beyond the headlines, beyond the dramatic images?
That's the key question, isn't it?
It really is. For our deep dive today, we're on a mission to sort of uncover those underlying connections.
Okay.
We're going to explore how power is understood and exercised, how justice is defined and distributed, and how civil disobedience emerges as this powerful, often controversial response when those two things collide.
Right, when they clash.
Exactly. Our goal here is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from, a pretty diverse stack of sources and give you a clear, comprehensive, yet, concise understanding of these fundamental concepts.
Sounds good.
So to truly dive in, we first need a foundational understanding. What exactly are we talking about when we use terms like power, justice, and civil disobedience? Let's maybe start with power.
Sure, so power. Generally, we're defining it as the ability to influence or direct the actions, beliefs, or conduct of others.
Okay, influence.
Yeah, but it's crucial to understand it's not just about direct force or coercion, like someone explicitly telling you what to do.
Right.
It can also be exerted through much more subtle, diffuse means. Think about institutions or even social norms.
So it's not just about who's obviously in charge, but something much broader, more embedded.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how many forms power actually takes. We see structural power, for instance.
Okay, structural power.
Yeah, that's about how actors are organized in relation to one another. Think about the historical relationship between, say, a master and an enslaved person, or even a modern employer and employee. That structure itself embodies power.
Got it. That makes sense.
Then there's discursive power. This is all about how language and the categories we use can legitimize certain behaviors or even entire groups. It shapes what we see as normal or acceptable.
So the way we talk about things actually gives them power or takes it away.
Precisely. And of course, there's authority that's power that's seen as legitimate or socially approved. Think of a police officer or a teacher. Their power comes partly from that social acceptance.
It sounds like it's not just about who holds the biggest stick then. It's also about relationships, language, these abstract ideas shaping behavior. Could you maybe break down the tactics of power a bit further?
Certainly. When we look at how power is actually applied, we can categorize the tactics. You have soft tactics versus hard tactics.
Soft versus hard.
Right. Soft tactics rely more on relationships, collaboration, socializing, that kind of thing to get things done. Whereas hard tactics are more forceful, direct, aimed at concrete outcomes. Think sanctions or overt demands.
Okay.
And interestingly, sometimes the fear of social exclusion, a soft pressure, can be a much stronger motivator than, say, physical punishment, which is a hard tactic.
That's interesting.
Then you have rational tactics using reasoning, logic versus non-rational tactics, which might rely on emotion, perhaps even misinformation.
Right. Logic versus emotion or something else.
Exactly. And finally, think about unilateral versus bilateral tactics. Unilateral means tactics are used without the target's participation. Bilateral tactics involve some kind of reciprocity or back and forth, like negotiation.
That framework is really helpful. And it feels like a great setup for talking about Michel Foucault, the philosopher you mentioned, who really pushed our understanding of power beyond just individuals or simple tactics.
Absolutely. Foucault's ideas were quite radical.
What did he mean when he said power is everywhere? That sounds huge.
It is huge. Foucault really moved away from the idea that power is just something wielded by, kings or presidents or specific groups. For him, power is everywhere means it's diffuse, it's embedded in our bodies, it's enacted in our daily lives. It's not something one simply possesses like an object.
This is not a thing you hold.
No. It's deeply discursive, intertwined with how we talk about and understand the world, and crucially, it actually shapes who we are as agents rather than just being deployed by us.
So Foucault is saying power isn't just this tool people use, but more like the invisible forces shaping our interactions, even our identities. What's the core insight there for us?
The really radical insight is that power isn't just held by leaders. It's kind of the very fabric of how we think, act, and even who we are. It's not something you just have, but something you do and are constantly shaped by.
Okay.
Foucault saw power as a kind of meta-power, or a regime of truth, something that's always in flux. It's constituted through accepted knowledge, through what a society considers truth. This power knowledge, as he called it, is produced and reinforced everywhere. Education systems, media, science.
And he said it wasn't just negative, not just stopping people from doing things.
Exactly, that's key. Foucault argued power is profoundly productive. It produces reality. It creates domains of objects and rituals of truth. It doesn't just say no, it actively shapes what is possible, what is known, what is real.
Wow, okay, produces reality. Can you give us a quick example of how an institution might produce reality in this way? Something concrete.
Absolutely. Think about the education system again. Through its curriculum, its testing methods, it doesn't just teach facts, right? It also shapes what society values as intelligence or success. It effectively produces a certain kind of reality about what it means to be educated or knowledgeable.
I see. It sets the terms.
Precisely. He also talked about disciplinary power. This is how administrative systems think. Prisons, schools, hospitals use surveillance and constant assessment to make people discipline themselves without overt force being needed all the time.
Self-regulation.
Yes. And related is biopower, which is about the control of populations through establishing norms about bodily conduct, health, reproduction, and so on.
So, biopower.
Yeah.
Controlling populations through norms.
Yeah.
Can you give an everyday example, maybe public health campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great example. Government guidelines on diet or exercise, for instance. They're not usually forced on you, but they establish a norm for what a healthy body is, subtly shaping population behavior and defining what's considered good for society's health.
It makes sense.
But it's important to add, Foucault also absolutely believed in resistance. He saw discourse itself, the way we talk and think, as a site of both power and resistance. There's always scope, he thought, to evade, subvert, or contest strategies of power.
What truly blows my mind here is how this pervasive power, shaping even truth and how we police ourselves, connects to our sense of fairness. How does it then shape what we consider fair or just in a society?
Well, that connects directly to the concept of distributive justice.
Right. Distributive justice.
At its core, distributive justice is about the socially just allocation of resources, goods, opportunities, you name it, within a society. It focuses specifically on the outcomes of distribution, often aiming for what we might call substantive equality.
Okay, the outcomes.
And most theories about this start from a basic precondition: material scarcity. The idea that there isn't, an infinite amount of stuff to go around.
Right, there's not enough for everyone to have everything they want.
Exactly. So we need principles to resolve the competing claims people make on those limited resources.
And how do different societies or groups within them typically decide what's fair when it comes to handing things out?
Well, people often look to their group's behavioral expectations, their norms. If how things are allocated aligns with these designated distributive norms, then people tend to perceive it as just.
Okay. And what are some of those main norms?
There are generally 5 main ones discussed. You have equality, which is simple. Everyone gets an equal share, regardless of their input or effort.
Okay, equal shares.
Then there's equity. This one says outcomes should be based on input, so more effort, more contribution, you get more reward, very common in workplaces, for example.
Right, you get what you put in.
Then there's power as a norm. Basically, those with more authority, status, or control receive more resources.
That one sounds less fair on the surface, maybe.
It can certainly lead to inequality, but it's a norm that definitely operates in many contexts. Then you have need. This focuses on giving resources to those in greatest need, regardless of their input. Think disaster relief or certain social safety nets.
Okay, need-based.
And finally, responsibility, which suggests that those who have more should share with those who have less. A sort of social obligation norm. The key insight here, I think, is how deeply these different ideas about fairness are embedded in our society. And they often clash, right? Because people are operating from different, often unspoken assumptions about what just actually means in a given situation.
That's a really clear framework.
Yeah.
But how do different philosophical theories tackle this idea of a just distribution on a bigger societal level?
Well, one of the most prominent thinkers here is John Rawls, with his theory of justice as fairness.
Rawls, right. Heard the name.
He proposed 3 core components. First, equality of basic rights and liberties for everyone. Second, equality of opportunities. And third, any economic inequalities that do exist should be arranged so they provide the greatest possible benefit to the least advantaged members of society.
Least advantaged. Okay.
And to get there, Rawls introduced this really famous thought experiment, the original position and the veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance?
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, imagine you're designing the basic structure of society, but this is the veil. You have no idea who you'll actually be in that society. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, talented or not, your gender, your race, your background. Nothing.
Wow. So you're choosing the rules completely blind to your own future position.
Exactly. Rawls argued that this veil of ignorance would force you to choose principles that are fair to everyone, especially protecting the worst off position, because, hey, you might end up there yourself.
That's a really powerful thought experiment. So what principles did he think would emerge from behind this veil?
He proposed two basic principles would be chosen. First, the liberty principle. Everyone should have an equal right to the most expensive basic liberties compatible with similar liberties for others. Freedom of speech, conscience, that sort of thing.
Okay, basic rights for all.
Second, the difference principle. This one has two parts. Social and economic inequalities are acceptable only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society, and these inequalities must be attached to positions and offices open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity.
So inequality is okay only if it lifts the bottom, and everyone has a fair shot at the better positions.
That's the essence of it. Now, there are other major theories too, of course.
Like what?
Well, there's utilitarianism. Its basic idea is that actions and policies are good if they increase the overall welfare or happiness of society as a whole. It's focused on maximizing the total outcome.
Right, the greatest good for the greatest number. But how do you measure welfare? That seems tricky.
It is tricky, and that's a major point of debate within utilitarianism. Then there's egalitarianism. This is rooted in the idea of the equal worth and moral status of all human beings.
Equal worth.
Yes. So it emphasizes equal treatment and respect for everyone. Egalitarians often focus less just on the final distribution outcome and more on the process. They want to create institutions that genuinely promote equal opportunities and actively address how unchosen circumstances like where you're born might unfairly disadvantage individuals.
Okay, focus on leveling the playing field.
You could put it that way. And then, of course, you have Marxism, which offers a very different critique and vision.
Right.
Famously encapsulated by slogans like, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, from Marx himself. And Lenin's edition, he who does not work, neither shall he eat, points towards a different principle during a transitional phase.
It definitely sounds like there are deeply held and sometimes really conflicting ideas about what makes a society just. What are some of the main criticisms leveled against this whole idea of distributive justice itself?
That's a crucial point, because some thinkers strongly critique the very concept. Friedrich von Hayek, for example, a major figure in classical liberalism.
Hayek, yeah.
He viewed terms like social justice or distributive justice as essentially meaningless, even dangerous, especially within a free market, or what he called a spontaneous order.
Meaningless. Why?
For Hayek, justice is primarily an attribute of individual actions and rules of conduct. It's not something that applies to the outcome of countless individual interactions in a market. He argued that trying to achieve a specific pattern of distribution, like Rawls' difference principle, would inevitably require a command economy, someone centrally directing resources.
And he saw that as incompatible with freedom.
Fundamentally incompatible. For him, the market outcome, whatever it is just if the rules of the game, like property rights and contract law, are just and applied equally.
Okay. Any other major critics?
Robert Nozick is another key figure here, often seen as a libertarian counterpoint to Rawls.
Nozick.
He argued there's no central distributor handing out slices of a social pie. In a free society, what people have, they get through Lockean principles of self-ownership, acquiring unowned things, voluntary exchange, or gifts.
So it's about how you got stuff, not the final pattern.
Exactly. Nozick championed an entitlement theory. If you acquired something justly, and if it was transferred to you justly, then your holding is just. There's no predetermined pattern, like equality or need, that a just distribution must fit. Any attempt to impose such a pattern violates individual rights, particularly property rights.
Okay, so we have these complex ideas about power, different takes on what constitutes justice. What does all this mean when people feel these systems, whether it's the distribution of resources or the exercise of power, aren't working? Or worse, are actively causing harm? This seems to lead us directly to civil disobedience.
Precisely. When people feel the established channels aren't working, or that the laws themselves are unjust, civil disobedience emerges as a potential response.
And how is that generally defined? Is there a standard definition?
The most widely accepted account, often attributed to Rawls again, defines it as a public, nonviolent, and conscientious breach of law. Crucially, it's undertaken with the aim of changing specific laws or government policies.
Okay. Public, nonviolent, conscientious law-breaking to change things.
Yes. And participants typically show a general respect for the broader legal system. They're not trying to overthrow the whole thing, and they're usually willing to accept the legal consequences of their actions. That acceptance is often seen as part of the statement.
So it's not just about breaking a law, but how you break it and why. The term itself is interesting, civil disobedience. Where did that actually come from?
Well, the term is generally credited to Henry David Thoreau.
Thoreau, right? Walden Pond guy.
That's him. He famously refused to pay his poll tax in Massachusetts as a protest against slavery and the Mexican-American War, and wrote an influential essay about it.
And the civil part, what does that mean?
It's evolved a bit. Originally, Thoreau likely meant civil in relation to civil government, meaning disobedience against state law. But over time, especially in the 20th century, civil has increasingly come to imply civility, a certain manner of protest involving self-restraint, nonviolence, politeness, that sort of thing.
Ah, okay. So it carries this implication of how the protest should be conducted now. That makes sense.
Right.
What are the key features, then, of civil disobedience, and what are some of the ongoing debates around them?
Okay, let's break it down. First, the absolute core. It must involve law breaking.
Got to break a law?
Yep. This can be direct civil disobedience, where you directly violate the law you're protesting. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat under segregation laws is a classic example.
Right, breaking the unjust law itself.
Or it can be indirect. This is where you break a different, maybe perfectly just law to protest another law or policy. Think of anti-war protesters conducting a sit-in that violates trespassing laws to protest a war policy.
While you indirect?
Sometimes the unjust law itself just can't be directly broken easily or safely, or maybe breaking it wouldn't be very visible. So indirect disobedience becomes a necessary tool.
Okay, law breaking, what else?
Second, it has to be principled and conscientious. It's a deliberate act based on sincere moral or political convictions. It's not supposed to be driven purely by self-interest, though. Well, it's acknowledged that sometimes civil disobedience can be self-interested, like those "not in my backyard" protests against, say, a waste dump. But the ideal, the core concept, emphasizes deeply held principles about justice or rights. Sincerity and seriousness are key.
Makes sense. Principled. What's next?
Then there's this broad and often debated concept of civility. This umbrella term covers several related ideas.
Okay, civility.
One aspect is communication. Civil disobedience is generally seen as inherently a communicative act. It's a symbolic appeal, usually aimed at the majority's sense of justice, trying to persuade them.
So it's like sending a message through action.
Exactly. This distinguishes it from, say, covert acts like animal rescue from a lab, where the primary aim might be the rescue itself, not public persuasion. Another aspect is publicity acting openly, not anonymously, and taking responsibility for your actions.
Acting in the oven.
Usually, yes, but there are debates here. Does publicity require giving advance warning, which might allow authorities to stop the protest? Can covert acts, like Edward Snowden's leaks, count if the person eventually takes responsibility? It gets complicated.
I can see that. What about nonviolence? That seems like a really core, but maybe contentious part of the civil package.
Hugely contentious and absolutely central to the traditional definition. Nonviolence is often seen as essential for civil disobedience to function as that mode of address, that appeal to conscience. The idea is you're not trying to coerce through harm, but persuade through suffering or moral witness.
But does everyone agree on that?
No, definitely not. Critics argue that sometimes certain forms of, let's say, violence, particularly property damage, can still convey a clear message of protest and frustration. Well, think about some arguments around, say, breaking windows during a protest against economic inequality, or perhaps even burning a police car during a Black Lives Matter protest. Some argue these acts, while destructive, communicate a profound anger at systemic issues in a way that peaceful marching might not.
Right. It's a debate about what constitutes legitimate communication.
Exactly. And authorities often lump property damage in with violence against persons, but many activists and theorists argue they're distinct categories. Some even argue minor symbolic property damage, like pacifists hammering on nuclear warheads, is compatible with nonviolence.
What about self-violence, like hunger strikes?
That's another complex area. Hunger strikes, self-immolation, they're acts of violence against the self. Figures like Gandhi had very nuanced views on them, recognizing they could be both persuasive appeals and highly coercive tactics.
So it's not just about what you do, but the message you're trying to send and whether it's received as intended. This brings up another point. Is civil disobedience primarily about persuasion, or can it be coercive too?
That's a great question, and it really highlights a crucial tension in the theory and practice. While civil disobedience is often idealized as purely persuasive, appealing to reason and conscience, many practitioners, including Martin Luther King Jr., explicitly recognize what he called the coercive face of nonviolence.
Coercive face?
Yeah. King affirmed that nonviolent direct action could, and sometimes should, create such a crisis-packed situation, such tension, that it forces a community that has refused to negotiate to confront the issue.
So forcing the issue, even without physical violence.
Exactly. Think about large-scale boycotts or disruptive land occupations. They don't involve physical harm, but they can absolutely be coercive. They inflict economic costs, disrupt normalcy, and are intended to force the target, whether it's a business or a government, to the negotiating table.
Okay, that adds another layer. What other features fall under civility?
Well, there's non-evasion, the general willingness to accept the legal consequences, the arrest, the trial, the punishment.
Why is that considered important?
It's traditionally seen as demonstrating fidelity to the rule of law in general. Even while breaking a specific law, it shows you respect the system overall. But even here, there's debate about tactics. Should you plead guilty or plead not guilty and use the trial to defend the justice of your actions?
Right.
And finally, sometimes decorum is included, behaving in a dignified, polite, respectful manner during the protest.
Decorum? That one sounds tricky.
It is. Critics strongly argue against decorum as a necessary requirement. They point out that demands for polite protest are often used by those in power to silence or delegitimize activists whose message is uncomfortable. Think about the criticism directed at groups like Pussy Riot for their provocative performances, or ACTUP for their confrontational tactics during the AIDS crisis, or even some critiques of Black Lives Matter protests. Their style was deemed uncivil, distracting from the substance of their grievances.
So this idea of fidelity to law, that civil disobedience signals respect for the legal system, it seems less straightforward in practice than it sounds in theory.
Precisely. The traditional liberal view emphasizes that respect for the legal system. However, much modern scholarship has taken what's called an anti-legal turn.
Anti-legal turn.
Meaning they argue that the requirement of civility is satisfied simply by engaging the public sphere communicatively, trying to persuade fellow citizens. You don't necessarily need to show deference to the legal system itself, especially if the system is part of the problem. Confrontational tactics can still be civil in this broader sense.
Okay.
And this relates to the critical turn in scholarship more generally. Researchers are critiquing those traditional, often narrow liberal accounts of civil disobedience, arguing they distort the reality of historical movements and can deter necessary resistance. They're re-examining movements like the American Civil Rights Movement to uncover a more radical, challenging understanding than the often sanitized version we get in public memory.
Fascinating.
The key insight from all these debates, really, is that the lines around what counts as civil and legitimate protest are constantly being contested and redrawn by both protesters and the authorities responding to them.
What really stands out to me, listening to all this, is that tension you mentioned. The gap between the sort of ideal definition of civil disobedience, public, nonviolent, respectful, and how it's actually practiced, and how messy and contested it gets.
Exactly. That tension is central.
So how does civil disobedience, with all its complexities, compare to other forms of protest? Can we categorize things a bit?
Yes, definitely. Thinking about these different categories helps clarify the nuances, especially around that civil aspect.
Okay.
So first, the most obvious contrast is with legal protest. This operates entirely within the established legal boundaries. Think permitted marches, petitions, lobbying, giving speeches. The key difference is, well, it doesn't break the law.
Right. Stays within the lines.
Then you have things like rule departures. This is where officials, maybe jurors or civil servants, conscientiously refuse to perform certain duties. Jury nullification, where a jury acquits despite the evidence, perhaps because they believe the law is unjust, is an example. Often this is perfectly legal for the official doing it.
Interesting. What else?
Conscientious objection. This is typically a personal refusal to conform to a specific rule or law based on conscience. Refusing military conscription is the classic example. But you could maybe include some forms of anti-vaccination stances here too. It's often private or aims for a personal exemption and isn't always unlawful if the law allows for objections.
So more personal, less about changing the law for everyone.
Often, yes. Though if done openly and collectively, it can certainly blur the lines with civil disobedience.
Okay. These feel like principled actions. But there may be stretching the boundaries of what we usually think of as civil disobedience. What happens when those boundaries get explicitly crossed, sometimes for deeply moral reasons?
That's where things get even more complex. You see actions like immigration disobedience.
Immigration disobedience.
Yeah, this term covers various unlawful tactics used specifically against anti-immigration policies. It can be transnational, like asylum seekers marching across borders without authorization, or it can involve citizens breaking laws to assist undocumented migrants, like the sanctuary movement.
Right. Actions driven by solidarity or perceived injustice in immigration law.
Exactly. Then there's the whole realm of digital disobedience. Using digital technologies for protest, think certain forms of hacking, piracy for political reasons, distributed denial of service, DDoS, attacks against government or corporate websites, creating open access code as a protest against proprietary systems.
And the debate there is about civility again.
Yes, because these acts are often covert, anonymous, the actors try to evade consequences, and sometimes they have a playful or disruptive quality that doesn't fit the traditional solemn public appeal model.
Okay. So what if the disobedience is principled but deliberately not civil in the traditional sense?
That brings us to the concept of uncivil disobedience. It's kind of an umbrella term for principled, law-breaking protest that intentionally violates one or more of those norms of civility we discussed.
So it could be covert, maybe involve violence or property damage, maybe evasive, maybe deliberately offensive.
Precisely. Examples might include clandestine animal rescues from labs, industrial sabotage for environmental reasons, certain forms of hacktivism, perhaps even riots if they're understood as principled political protest rather than just random violence.
Any historical examples spring to mind?
Emmeline Pankhurst and the militant wing of the British suffragette movement are often cited. They engaged in window smashing, arson, and other destructive tactics alongside more conventional protests. Modern scholarship tries to analyze these uncivil acts on their own terms, asking if they can be justified even if they don't fit the neat Rolson box.
Right, not just dismissing them as not proper protest.
Exactly. And finally, at the far end of the spectrum, you have revolutionary action. This signifies a much deeper opposition, not just to specific laws, but to the entire regime or system itself. It often involves more forceful resistance and potentially moves into the realm of just war theory if it involves large-scale violence aiming for regime change.
Wow, that's a really helpful way to categorize these different forms of resistance, from legal protest all the way to revolution. It really highlights the spectrum, and it makes me think again about how power operates not just, on the streets during a protest, but within the very structures of society. Like police forces, for example. We touched on authority earlier. How does accountability work there? Let's pivot to that for a moment.
Absolutely. The accountability of police is fundamental precisely because society grants them the unique authority to use force. Traditionally, policing often operated under what's called a command and control model.
Command and control sounds military.
It has that flavor. Centralized, top-down hierarchy based on rules and regulations with a strong emphasis on law enforcement, quotas, discipline, that kind of thing.
And what were the pros and cons of that approach? Did it work?
Well, it had some definite successes. Compared to earlier eras, it often reduced direct political interference and corruption in policing. It led to improvements in officer training, standards, and legal constraints on the use of force. It made service delivery arguably more equitable, and it improved the capacity to handle large-scale public order situations like riots that require coordinated responses.
Okay, so some positives in terms of professionalization and control.
Yes. But there were significant strains, big downsides. Basic patrol work is inherently unpredictable, varied, involves lots of minor situations. It's not easily routinized or controlled by rigid rules from the top down. Direct supervision out on the beat is often minimal.
Right, officers have to make judgment calls constantly.
Exactly. They retain a high degree of discretion in practice, regardless of the rule book. And this command and control structure, paradoxically, often fostered that infamous blue curtain culture, strong internal solidarity among officers, sometimes an us versus them mentality, and a degree of isolation from the citizens they police. Accountability could be more about loyalty to the hierarchy than to the public.
So while it brought some order, it wasn't a perfect fit for the realities of day-to-day policing and building community trust. How does the idea of community policing try to address these accountability challenges?
Well, community policing models generally require increased officer discretion and empowerment, pushing decision-making down to the neighborhood level to solve local problems collaboratively.
More discretion. Doesn't that make accountability harder?
It makes it arguably even more critical, but requires a different approach. The shift is away from relying solely on enforcing formal rules and towards actively shaping the organization's values.
Vaping values. How?
By emphasizing adherence not just to rules, but to fundamental principles. The law, the Constitution, professional ethics, and crucially, community ideals and priorities. It's about internalizing norms, not just following orders.
Okay. And what mechanisms do you use for accountability in that kind of model?
It involves a mix. Things like enhanced education and values-based training going beyond just the legal minimums, using reward systems like peer review or performance contracts tied to community goals, not just arrest numbers, and discipline systems that are sophisticated enough to distinguish between honest mistakes made in good faith and genuine incompetence or misconduct.
Trying to build a different kind of culture.
Exactly. And ideally, it leads towards mutual accountability, where the police and the community work together to define the problems, agree on the tactics, and develop shared measures of success. It's more like a partnership model, where both sides have responsibilities and hold each other accountable.
Like a physician and patient working together on a treatment plan, maybe?
Ooh,
Both accountable.
That's a good analogy used in the literature, yes. Both are accountable to the agreed-upon plan and its success.
So if power operates in these subtle, sometimes difficult to manage ways within our own institutions, how does that scale up? What happens on the biggest stage of all global governance? How does power play out there?
Global governance. Well, a crucial point that emerges from the scholarship here is this fundamental tension. The nation-state still remains the primary place where political decisions are made and where leaders are held accountable, through elections or other domestic political processes.
Right. We vote for our national leaders, not a world president.
Exactly. And this structure, this primary loyalty to the nation-state, often hinders effective global cooperation, even on massive shared challenges where everyone agrees action is needed, like climate change or pandemics. National interests often trump global needs.
So what does global governance actually look like then? Is there an ideal versus the reality?
There really are two quite different visions often discussed. The ideal vision, perhaps, is of global governance as a framework for creating a fair, just, and efficient world, providing global public goods like climate stability or pandemic preparedness, and establishing a rules-based international system that protects smaller, weaker countries from the arbitrary power of larger, more powerful ones.
That sounds good. Well, ideal. What's the reality often like?
The reality, according to many analysts, is that global governance frequently functions more as a mechanism through which powerful states and corporate interests exert their influence and extract benefits from less powerful countries.
How so?
Global agreements, for instance, often end up compelling developing countries to adopt policies, say, on trade, intellectual property, or finance that primarily benefit richer nations or multinational corporations, sometimes without strong justification based on global welfare. Meanwhile, powerful countries often face few real consequences if they violate international norms or agreements when it suits them.
That paints a pretty stark picture of global imbalance. I know Oxfam's recent Inequality Inc. report touched on this quite dramatically. What were their key findings again?
Yes, that report paints a truly stark reality. They found that since 2020, the 5 richest men in the world have actually doubled their fortunes.
Doubled. Wow.
While, during the same period, almost 5 billion people globally have become poorer. They project that at current rates, it could take 230 years to end global poverty. But the world might see its first trillionaire in just the next 10 years.
That is staggering. What did they identify as the drivers?
They point squarely at a huge concentration of corporate power globally, arguing that this power exacerbates inequality by squeezing workers' wages and rights, enabling massive tax dodging by corporations and the super rich, pushing for privatization of public services like health and education, and driving climate breakdown, which disproportionately harms poorer communities.
And their solution?
Their main call to action is for governments to fundamentally rein in and radically redistribute this corporate power, putting it back in the hands of ordinary people through measures like breaking up monopolies, taxing wealth and excess profits, strengthening labor rights, and investing in public services.
Given these immense power imbalances, how do some scholars, like Stiglitz and Roderick you mentioned, propose we might design global governance to be more equitable, or at least less harmful?
Well, Joseph Stiglitz and Donny Roderick argue for what they call a minimalist global governance architecture. They propose a few key principles.
Okay. Minimalist. What's the first principle?
First, they focus on what they call bigger than neighbor policies, or BTNs. The idea is that international rules should generally allow countries maximum policy space and autonomy unless they engage in policies that clearly benefit them primarily by explicitly imposing significant costs on foreign countries.
Like what kind of policies?
Classic examples are things like import tariffs designed solely to protect domestic industry at others' expense, competitive currency devaluations to gain a trade advantage, or creating tax havens that drain revenue from other nations. They argue the focus should be on preventing these clear harms rather than trying to harmonize everything.
But they add a caveat about large countries.
Yes, they note that ideally, systemically large countries whose policies have huge global ripple effects should face higher scrutiny and accountability for any adverse impacts on poorer nations, though they acknowledge this is politically very difficult to achieve in practice.
Okay, avoid bigger thy neighbor. What's this second principle?
Second, they stress that international agreements absolutely must reflect and accommodate the marked variations among countries. Nations have different preferences, different historical trajectories, different levels of economic development, different social contracts.
So one size doesn't fit all.
Definitely not. For example, an intellectual property regime that might make sense for the U.S. with its advanced tech sector is probably not well suited for a developing country trying to build its industrial capacity or access essential medicines. Trying to impose global harmonization across the board can be inefficient and unfair.
Right. Respect diversity. What's third?
Third, global agreements need to explicitly address global fairness, going beyond just economic efficiency. Poorer nations shouldn't be expected to bear disproportionate costs for solving global problems. They largely didn't create climate change, being the prime example, where advanced economies hold the historical responsibility.
So fairness means?
It requires things like significant resource and technology transfers from the global north to the global south to support climate adaptation and mitigation. And they specifically warn developing countries against signing agreements like some recent tax deals pushed by the OECD where they make significant concessions, like giving up the right to impose digital taxes in return for minimal expected benefits or revenue gains.
Got it. Fairness and avoiding bad deals. What's the final principle?
The final principle is to always consider the broad social and political consequences of international economic arrangements.
Meaning how they impact society beyond just the economy.
Exactly. They argue that imposing excessive limits on the autonomy of national policymakers, forcing them to adopt policies dictated by international agreements, can seriously undermine democratic accountability within a country. If elected leaders can't respond to their citizens' needs because their hands are tied by global rules, it can breed resentment, erode trust in democracy, and potentially fuel the rise of authoritarian populism.
That's a really crucial point about democracy. So, bearing these principles in mind, if even well-intentioned global agreements can backfire if they don't account for power dynamics and national differences.
All right.
What are some real-world examples of where global cooperation has stumbled or failed recently?
Unfortunately, there are quite a few examples highlighted in the sources. Let's look at a few key areas.
Okay.
Climate change, as we mentioned. Despite near-universal agreement on the urgency, there's significant resistance, particularly from powerful financial interests, even to relatively costless solutions like large-scale issuance of IMF special drawing rights, SDRs, to fund climate action in developing countries.
Even when it doesn't cost taxpayers directly.
Apparently so, perhaps due to concerns about inflation or impacts on financial markets that benefit certain actors, then pandemics and intellectual property during the COVID-19 crisis.
Yes, the vaccine equity issue.
Exactly. Requests from countries like South Africa and India for temporary waivers of IP rights under the TRIPS agreement to allow wider manufacturing of vaccines and treatments faced what were described as insurmountable barriers. These were largely attributed to the powerful lobbying influence of major pharmaceutical companies on their home governments in wealthy nations, prioritizing corporate profits over faster global access and health equity.
Now, that seems like a clear case of power imbalance shaping outcomes.
It certainly appears that way. Let's look at multinational taxation. The traditional transfer pricing system, over a century old, proved deeply flawed, allowing companies like Apple, for instance, to legally route billions in European profits through subsidiaries in low-tax Ireland, paying minimal tax.
Right, the Apple Ireland case was huge.
The OECD's recent BEPS initiative aimed to fix some of this, but critics argue the resulting global minimum tax deal, while a step, was heavily influenced by rich countries and offers very little additional revenue for most developing countries. It highlights the need for decision-making venues where developing nations have a stronger, more equal voice.
Okay, what about investment rules?
Investment agreements are another area. Initially intended to protect foreign investors from expropriation, they evolved, especially through bilateral investment treaties, BITs, to grant foreign investors far more rights than domestic businesses. Crucially, they often included investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS mechanisms.
ISDS, the private arbitration panels.
Exactly. Allowing corporations to sue governments in private, unaccountable tribunals, often bypassing domestic courts if they felt a government regulation, even environmental or health rules, undermined their expected profits. These lacked transparency and robust appeal processes.
Have things changed there?
Somewhat. There's been a backlash. Both the U.S. under recent administrations and the European Union have moved away from supporting ISDS in new agreements, recognizing these clauses can hinder a government's ability to regulate in the public interest, for example, to manage a green transition.
That's a positive shift, maybe. What about trade?
Trade policy is also in flux. The old assumptions of the post-WTO order are being challenged. For example, green industrial policies like China's massive subsidies for solar panels or the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, supporting clean energy, might technically distort trade according to old rules, but can be hugely beneficial globally for tackling climate change. Yet, the de facto rules and enforcement still often favor the trade agendas of rich countries. The argument is we need to move towards that minimalist approach, prioritize national policy space, avoid clear beggar-thy-neighbor actions, but don't try to enforce overly restrictive rules that prevent necessary action.
Makes sense. And the last area, debt.
Yes. Sovereign debt remains a critical, often crippling problem for many poor countries, unlike within countries where there are established bankruptcy procedures for individuals and corporations.
Right, there's a legal process.
There is no equivalent comprehensive international framework for handling sovereign debt crises fairly and efficiently. A proposal for such a framework was actually approved by the UN General Assembly, but powerful creditor nations and institutions have consistently blocked its implementation.
So what happens instead?
Debt negotiations often become, as Stiglitz puts it, basically a power game, a kind of law of the jungle, where the outcomes depend heavily on the relative bargaining power of the debtor country versus its various creditors, rather than on clear, fair principles. This leads to prolonged crises and immense suffering.
So putting all these global examples together, climate, health, tax, investment, trade, debt. What's the big picture takeaway here about global governance?
The overall conclusion from these analyses is pretty sobering. Global governance, as it currently operates, tends to reflect and reinforce existing power imbalances. It often suffers from significant deficiencies in democratic accountability. Powerful actors, both state and corporate, are frequently able to cloak their self-interest in the language of virtue or global cooperation.
So ambitious global agendas can actually backfire.
They can, especially if they're pushed through without genuine buy-in or consideration for diverse national circumstances. They can lead to negative outcomes, like premature deindustrialization in developing countries, increased inequality, or a backlash against globalization itself. That's why the argument for a more minimalist, cautious approach focusing on preventing clear harms rather than imposing grand designs is seen by some as safer, at least for now.
But is there any hope for greater progress?
Perhaps. Some analysts suggest that maybe competition between emerging global blocs rather than just cooperation could create more space for alternatives. And ultimately, hopes for more just global outcomes likely depend on the strengthening of transnational social movements, pushing for social and economic justice, challenging power imbalances from below, across borders.
Okay. We've really covered a lot of ground. We've unpacked how power manifests in so many different forms, from the personal to the global. We've seen how it shapes our very understanding of justice and how those ideas of justice themselves are diverse and often contested. And we've explored how civil disobedience in as many varied forms, some fitting the traditional civil mold, others deliberately challenging it, emerges as this critical, albeit complex and debated response when people feel those systems of power and justice are failing them. We've seen power is everywhere, from subtle social norms to overt global economic structures, and that justice is this constant, ongoing negotiation.
It really is.
So considering this pervasive nature of power and its profound influence on everything from our definitions of fairness to our modes of resistance, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over. What kind of power literacy, what kind of understanding of how power works do you think is most crucial for individuals like us to cultivate if we want to effectively navigate and maybe even help shape this complex world towards a more just future?